In 1980, Nickelodeon introduced 3 shows that were actually just programming blocks, but they called them shows, but really they were just programming blocks. There was Children's Classics, an airing of 1970s BBC literary adaptations of things like The Prince and the Pauper, Robin Hood, and David Copperfield, which I argued were too dry for the intended young audience. Then there were first row features, which made the much smarter decision of getting the rights to the Children's Film Foundation, a collection of hour-long movies actually made with children in mind. And now we get to the third and hand downs the most successful of these shows but actually programming blocks, Special Delivery, with a 13-year run between 1980 and 1993, making it one of the longest running shows in the channel's history, matching the lengths of shows like Rugrats, Nick News, and Blue's Clues. To run longer, you need to have the clout of a SpongeBob SquarePants or Fairly Odd Parents. Of course, there's a significant difference between Special Delivery and the rest of those shows. Their longevity came from quality work and making a connection with their audience. Special Delivery stuck around for as long as it did because it didn't have to do much of anything. Special Delivery aired whatever. It had absolutely no theme. It didn't pull from a single library like Children's Classics or Front Row Features. It was an hour or 2-hour block that aired literally whatever Nickelodeon just happened to have the rights to that day. Sometimes you might get a movie. Sometimes you might get a rock concert. Sometimes you might get a single episode of a TV show that Nickelodeon otherwise never aired. Hey, what do we do with the one and only one episode of The Kids of Degrassi Street we licensed? Throw it on a Special Delivery. Special Delivery isn't a television show. It's Nickelodeon's junk drawer. Okay, that sounds mean. I don't really mean that in a negative way, and it actually did serve multiple important functions in Nickelodeon's lineup. In these early days of the channel, having an hour or two of whatever that you could shift around as you see fit would have been very helpful in hammering out schedules as new shows were brought in and old shows were taken out. Well, kids aren't really responding to that what will they think of next show. Let's drop it, shift a few shows to earlier slots, and fill the gap with a Special Delivery until we find something to replace it with. It also served as a testing ground for potential imported show pickups. Episodes of Belle and Sebastian, Dr. Snuggles, and Grimm's Fairy Tale Classics first appeared on Special Delivery before airing regularly on the channel. Potentially any other show that aired there might have been considered for pickup at one point or another. If that one and only one episode of The Kids of Degrassi Street had really taken off, if the ratings were good, or if kids wrote in saying they wanted to see more of it, we might have had a world where the Degrassi franchise had its American home on Nickelodeon proper and not the N. And probably the least interesting thing Special Delivery did was give us space to broadcast reruns of shows that had already been taken off the air. Old episodes of Kids' Rights aired on the broadcast block a few years after Nickelodeon officially canceled them, which really is where this show deserves its junk drawer moniker the most. And that's all you can really say about Special Delivery as a product unto itself. No theme, no overall idea, just a designated space for Nickelodeon to tinker, experiment, and if they're just too busy, throw out whatever they happen to have at hand. During periods of actual effort, Nickelodeon would run classroom screenings and evaluate reactions. According to Eileen Opatut, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Nickelodeon's manager of acquisitions in 1983, only 1 in 20 submissions met the channel's standards for airing. Above all, they've got to be lots and lots of fun. They must have a very exciting message about kids' lives, their experiences, and fantasies. Of course, that was just the standard of practices for Nickelodeon in 1983, and with a number of changing hands over the programming block's 13-year run, not the least of which being the transition between Cy Schneider and Geraldine Laybourne as president, how Special Delivery ran its selections was almost certainly in a constant flux. There's no official listings of what Special Delivery aired over its run, but we do have a pretty substantial list thanks to a handful of dedicated people on Wikipedia who have been poring over newspaper TV guides to build up a list of over 160 airings. We may never know everything that aired on Special Delivery, but we definitely have a substantial profile. Of course, talking about every single thing that aired would be ridiculous, so instead I've made a profile of that profile and selected 6 items that I think both represents the Special Delivery experience and had unique significance to Nickelodeon itself. The earliest known airing of Special Delivery, possibly the first airing of Special Delivery, came on Christmas Day 1980, with his 1954 musical stop-motion adaptation of Hansel and Gretel. But Greg, you say, Hansel and Gretel has nothing to do with Christmas. And you would be right, except that this version of the Brother Grimm story was adapted from an 1893 opera composed by Engelbert Humperdinck, which has to be the most 19th century name to ever exist. The opera was first performed on December 23rd and has come to be associated with Christmas time performances. You know, in Germany. Hansel and Gretel is certainly an interesting piece of animation history. It's the first American feature-length stop-motion production, and the first non-Disney animated film to hit theaters since 1941's Mr. Bug Goes to Town. Stop-motion animation is my favorite kind of animation to think about, and the most impressive element is the size of it all. Detailed three-dimensional figures moving around a properly scaled, deep, dark forest. And that's about all the enjoyment I got out of this. The truth of the matter is that Hansel and Gretel is not a fairy tale with a lot of meat on its bones. A poor couple ditches their kids in the woods, the kids find a witch's house made of candy, the witch threatens to eat them, but the two kill the witch first, and then they return to the home that abandoned them, but it's okay because the mother died. Now obviously that had to be softened for the family audiences of the 20th century, and in this version, Hansel and Gretel get lost picking wild strawberries, and the parents are desperately trying to search for them. But the bigger issue is that you only need about 15 minutes to tell this story, 20 tops. This film is 72 minutes long. That means both stretching things out for length and introducing new elements into the story, and boy howdy do they do both. You want to know when Hansel and Gretel get to the candy house, the big money shot of the entire story? 42 minutes. 42 minutes before those innocent children start nomming on that witch's house. What do they do in the 41 minutes before that? Mostly just wander around, finding strawberries, eating those strawberries, singing a bit. And then there's a subplot where it's late at night and they meet the Sandman, who's just this guy in the woods in his pajamas. He leads them to a comfortable spot, knocks them unconscious with his special powder, and then angels fly down to watch the two kids sleep. This has nothing to do with anything. It's just Humperdinck going, "Ah, crap, you can't have a half-hour opera." Okay, end of Act 1, a guy in his underwear shows up. On the musical side of things, well, it's opera. It's less segmented songs and more people just singing their dialogue. It's hardly catchy, but that might just be me. I like to pretend I'm a person of culture, but opera isn't usually my speed. Combine that with a lack of technical polish. This is a completely independent production, later picked up for distribution by RKO, and there are a lot of seams showing. Frames where rigs are visible, in one moment where one of the puppets completely changes costumes mid-shot. Historical interest aside, this was a chore to sit through. That said, it is fitting that this was the first Special Delivery, at least in theory. With a vast amount of films and television adaptations of fairy tales and classic literature, there was no shortage of these kind of stories for Nickelodeon to choose from. From Little Women to The Jungle Book, Wind in the Willows to The Little Princess, this was reliable material that appealed to parents, and if the adaptations were good, appealed to children as well. These are, after all, considered classics. Not that that's a guarantee, as both this version of Hansel and Gretel and the way too dry children's classics demonstrates.
Home of the All-American Soapbox Derby in Akron, Ohio. To reach the national championships, thousands of boys and girls across the nation each year build coasting cars to race down local hills. The purpose of the Derby is to encourage craftsmanship and sportsmanship. In 1973, this 36-year-old family institution was rocked by scandal and almost died. The champion, Jimmy Gronin from Boulder, Colorado, had used a magnet in his car.
While a well-known fairy tale is nice every once in a while, I find myself drawn to the more obscure and more interesting, and Special Delivery had no shortage of that either. Take this half-hour documentary from 1973, The Day the Derby Almost Died. Essentially a sports documentary that treats soapbox car racing with the same legitimacy given to baseball. which starts as a casual piece about those year's races, finding interesting things to talk about, like how a few girls are participating in what's largely been a boy-dominated sport, but then ends up knee-deep in conspiracy when it's gradually discovered that one of the participants is using an illegally modified derby car that uses magnets to give it a speed advantage. This hurt the reputation of the derby so badly that it was nearly shut down. Yes, this was to the derby what the Lance Armstrong doping scandal was to the Tour de France. Which is interesting because that sort of cheating at sports narrative wasn't really a thing in 1973. Steroids didn't become a banned substance in baseball until 1991. It would be 7 years before Rosie Ruse won the Boston Marathon by taking the subway. Outside of the occasional bookie fixing a ball game or a boxing match, there just wasn't a lot of sports scandals before the age of VHS. Certainly none that threatened the integrity of an entire sport. Then here comes 14-year-old Jimmy and his homemade magnet car, and suddenly everything is turned on its head. It's just a weird thing to think about in a post-Barry Bonds world. Nickelodeon has never really felt sure with itself about how much it should engage with sports. Their biggest effort, of course, came with Reggie Jackson's World of Sports in 1981, which we'll be getting to shortly. There was the skateboarding enthusiast show Skate TV in 1990, Sports Illustrated for Kids in 1999, I guess Rocket Power counts. But Nickelodeon's never bet a lot of money on sports as a major attention getter for their young audience. Not even when they created a spin-off channel called Games and Sports for Kids, which is pretty much just a place to air reruns of their old game shows. In these brief moments of figuring out if they were going to focus on sports, Special Delivery offered Nickelodeon the chance to sprinkle sportings material around to enhance their full-length shows. Sports programs and documentaries that aired on Special Delivery included the BMX World Championships in 1984, both the 84 and 85 Rolex Junior Tennis Championships, the Young American Bowling Alliance in 1990, the American Youth Soccer Organization Championships in 1990, and even another stab at the Boxcar Derby in 1990. Again, that's just from the listings we know about, but if those are accurate, you'll notice that the biggest concentration of athletic material came in 84 and 85, the peak of Nickelodeon's run of Reggie Jackson's World of Sports, and again in 1990, when they were airing Skate TV. I realize I'm theory crafting here, but I don't think it's a coincidence that all of this sports specials happened when there was a major sports show on the network. This may well be an example of how Special Delivery acted in an area of support, helping prop up other material on the station and help figure out what Nickelodeon should be focusing on.
See the Spaniard, eats a chocolate. See the Spaniard, take it all. See the Spaniard, trusting no one. He's on Quality Street. He's on Quality Street.
One thing they definitely wanted to focus on was popular music. Concert films were the main attraction for the first half of Special Delivery's run and became a part of the early Nickelodeon ethos, being featured in its advertising. And unlike sports, Nickelodeon was pretty sure it wanted to focus on pop music. We've already discussed Pop Clips, television's first home for music videos, and Livewire was bringing in new and exciting acts for performances and interviews. After Pop Clips ended, music videos would return to Nickelodeon in the form of Nick Rocks. The primary focus of the Cy Schneider years was to provide wholesome edutainment for the young audience, but there still needed to be a hook to grab young adults as they got home from school, and for a while, music was their answer to that. Alas, music can move fast, and getting broadcast rights can move slow. By the time Special Delivery aired the Prince Charming Revue, a concert by Adam and the Ants in promotion of their 1981 album Prince Charming, the band had already been broken up for a year. Not that it wasn't worth airing. It's fun and theatrical in the way only British new wave rock from the 80s could be. Look at me, Ma, I'm a pirate who fell into a glitter factory. Other artists featured on Special Delivery included David Johansen, Duran Duran, Haircut 100, Talk Talk, Depeche Mode, Bob Welsh, Kansas, and Kajagoogoo. Around 1985, though, during the great Laybourne era shifting its focus, the concert films began to drop off. Along with the cancellation of Livewire, that hook to grab the young adult audience changed from music to narrative television. You know, drama and comedy. Thankfully, if you wanted short, made-for-TV movies for a young audience, you had a couple of options.
So my mom does this whole number on me about how I have to do 2 hours of homework every night.
Oh, I get that all the time, too.
Yeah, but get this. She says if I don't, I can just forget parties and sleepovers and stuff.
Oh, you're kidding.
No. I mean, sometimes I think she lies awake at night just trying to think of ways to make my life miserable.
Yeah.
14-year-old Victoria isn't exactly a model student. Pulling pranks on the teachers, smoking in the bathroom, she's constantly in trouble with her mother, Francine. Why can't mom just understand that being a teenager is really hard, you know? I bet my mother was never a kid. In an attempt to get out of a punishment, Victoria heads over to her friend's house for the night. While in the New York City subway, she takes a nasty smack on the head, and when she comes to, everything seems different. The streets are clean, the people are wearing old-fashioned clothes, and people are talking about the war. Oh my gosh, it's 1944. Victoria has traveled back in time. She ends up getting help from a girl named Cece, and the two bond over how much their mothers just don't understand them. Yeah, you've probably already guessed the twist. Cece is Victoria's mother as a kid, and this half-hour film wisely doesn't waste any time getting to that point. Victoria gets to witness her mother act much like she acts, but from an outsider perspective, realizes how weird and immature these actions are. When she finally returns to the present of 1980, she both knows that her mother was a kid just like her, and maybe she should change her behavior and grow up a little. Empathy and maturity. Hooray! You'll probably not be surprised to discover that My Mother Was Never a Kid originally aired in 1980 as part of the ABC After School Special, an anthology series of short films focusing on young adult issues, from day-to-day stuff like school and friends, to more dramatic things like teen pregnancy, drug abuse, and racism. Beginning in 1972, the ABC After School Special already had a pretty substantial backlog by the time Nickelodeon premiered, but Special Delivery didn't just draw from that, but from their direct competitors, such as the NBC Special Treat and the CBS School Break Special. I don't know how Nickelodeon managed that. All of these programs were still airing on network television when Special Delivery mixed and matched their stuff. But it does show how samey and indistinct everything in the after-school special market was. The after-school special has grown a reputation of sanctimonious morality, and there's something to be said of them as an evolution of the ethics shorts of the 40s and 50s that often got made fun of on Mystery Science Theater 3000, only now created in a post-baby boomer, post-civil rights, post-second wave feminism, post-summer of love environment that produced a lot of conversation about societal morality, which was seeing massive shifts in the 60s and 70s. For example, a lot of these after-school specials dealt with divorce because divorce rates skyrocketed in the 1970s because the introduction of no-fault divorce in the late 60s made the process easier and allowed those trapped in bad abusive marriages to escape them. Divorce, something commonly seen as a moral failing by American society, was becoming a common, neutral thing among families. And having a show on TV that says that this is all right, the world isn't ending, your life is just changing, not falling apart, had value in adjusting a young audience to these cultural shifts. The 70s were a big time for that kind of thing. Nixon began the war on drugs, so more addiction stories. The voting age dropped from 21 to 18, which also caused a lot of states to lower their drinking age for a time, so we had more alcoholic stories. What makes My Mother Was Never a Kid unique in this is in creating a direct comparison to kids from the late 70s to kids from the 40s, bringing forward how much in American culture has changed and how much has stayed the same. It isn't entirely effective in presenting that. A lot of the girl out of time stuff is mostly just, gee, clothes sure were weird back then, and man, payphones used to be a lot cheaper. What it does a better job with is suggesting an open dialogue between children and parents. Hey kids, your parents went through a lot of the same stuff you're going through now. Talk to them about it. Hey parents, remember how you were when you were a kid? Consider that when talking to your children. And that's a pretty good message all told. The reason that these after-school specials feel corny in modern eyes is because those cultural shifts became a normal thing for newer generations. Yeah, these days your parents getting a divorce is stressful, but it's not the result of a new, seemingly apocalyptic wave of families breaking apart like it seemed like 45 years ago. The after-school specials are very much of their time, made for late-period baby boomers and early-period Gen Xers. They're going to play weird for millennials, much in the same way, say, a Captain Planet episode from 1992 about the AIDS epidemic would play weird to Generation Z kids who are growing up in a world where AIDS isn't nearly as stigmatized. What this means is that the after-school specials had expiration dates, and the later special delivery reran these things the closer to that date they were. Of course, I'm not implying that art is only relevant to certain time periods and then should vanish into thin air. These specials have historical value and there's still enjoyment to get out of them, even if that enjoyment has become more ironic than sincere. But this wasn't a matter of historical preservation for Nickelodeon. This was filler. It was a presumably easy film library to get, already made for and screened by young audiences, and fitting in enough with the Nickelodeon of the late 80s that you didn't really have to think too hard when slapping one of these up. And maybe that's okay, because they needed stuff to fill the spaces between test airing actual television shows.
Eagles can fly and rabbits run, and when they're done, they're just like me. I'm free, I'm me in my nest, my home. Hi-yo,
The Nickelodeon of the 1980s was made on imports. For most of the decade, imported shows outnumbered original shows 4 to 1, 5 to 1 sometimes. This was necessary because for a while, Nickelodeon was losing money, and bringing in pre-existing shows from around the world was cheaper than creating new ones from scratch, which is not to say that importing wasn't a gamble. Being able to get a sense of audience reaction ahead of time would prove to be a useful tool in designing the channel's output year by year. As I previously mentioned, certain shows first aired on special delivery before becoming regular shows in the rotation. There were also times that special delivery aired an episode or two of some foreign television show, either English language or dubbed in English, and I think it's safe to assume that some of these instances were shows that were being considered to become regulars, but ultimately didn't make the cut. Shows like the 1971 Japanese-French co-production Zoom the White Dolphin, 1986 Cuckoo Land from New Zealand, 1984 British science fiction serial Chalky, or the 1982 Canadian production of Spirit Bay. I don't know for sure if any of these shows were actually considered to be part of Nickelodeon full-time, but there's a possibility for all of them. In fact, I wasn't sure which of these 4 examples to talk about, so I put it to a Twitter poll, and my followers selected Spirit Bay. And for good reason. Spirit Bay was the first television show with an almost all Aboriginal cast, telling stories of a small Ojibwe reservation in Ontario. The only exception in the cast was the main character Rabbit, played by Trevor Smith, a boy whom one of the reservation families fosters. This gives us a fish-out-of-water point-of-view character to introduce First Nations lives and cultures and ideas. Though saying he's the main character is a bit misleading, more that he's the member of the ensemble with the most focus. There are episodes where Rabbit is more a secondary character, and some where he's not even in them at all. He's a point of entry, and certainly doesn't overshadow a great cast of who turn out to be some of our best Aboriginal actors, including Graham Greene, Tantu Cardinal, Gary Farmer, Shirley Chichu, Tom Jackson, Monique Moika, Margot Kane, and George Clutesi. The types of stories told in the series varies wildly. In one episode, an airplane carrying blood necessary for an emergency appendicitis crashes into the woods, and Rabbit has to weather the elements to save the pilot and the blood, a daring wilderness thriller. Another episode has Rabbit learn that his foster mother is pregnant and worries it'll mean being shafted into another foster family, young adult drama. And another sees Rabbit and his friend Hack believe that they've been cursed with bad luck by little people of native folklore, and they go on a quest to appease them, a sort of comedy of errors. Spirit Bay is a lot of different things, like real life. Sometimes your days are silly and fun, sometimes they're complicated and nerve-wracking. What Spirit Bay does is present normal, effective human drama through the lens of First Nations culture, and then introduces issues fairly exclusive to those cultures. One episode has a logging company trying to buy out reservation land and displace those living there. Another involves Hack's uncle trying to take a medicine bag that's been passed down from generation to generation so that he can sell it to a museum. And another has a museum try to claim an old skeleton while the community wants to give the skeleton a proper ceremonial burial. The show is immensely sympathetic with how First Nations history and culture is taken and sold by a predominantly white world. While Spirit Bay is clearly on the side of Aboriginal societies, it's also a show created by a predominantly white media entity. Series creators Paul Stevens and Eric Jordan are not First Nations, as are none of the screenwriters. First Nations people were brought in as story consultants and had other creative roles behind the scenes. The theme song was written and performed by Buffy St. Marie. But the final say on the show was given to non-First Nations creators. And isn't that exactly what the show is critical of? The buying and selling of Aboriginal culture? It's not that this material wasn't handled with care, but people should be allowed to tell their own stories. Ojibwe screenwriter Drew Hayden Taylor, who worked on Spirit Bay as a consultant, praised the show for how much it involved Native voices and listened to their ideas, but even with a great deal of sympathy in the writer's room, there was still a conflict of cultural differences. In the May 1987 issue of Cinema Canada, Taylor says this: Native writers at Spirit Bay were allowed to proceed as far as the treatment stage before their story was given to a professional screenwriter. The producers felt that Indian writers weren't experienced enough to handle a half-hour dramatic script, though many of the Native writers disagreed. It is important for the producer to consider the different styles of Native writing, which has grown out of the tradition of storytelling. Our literature doesn't necessarily fit the standard Western three-act formula of television writing. The concept of Western drama is based on conflict that propels the story along. Things are resolved by shouting matches or some other equally dramatic action. All writers in the field are familiar with the standard formula, setup, confrontation, resolution, that predominates in Western cinema. On the whole, Native writing doesn't lend itself very well to this style. To verbally admonish someone or create an incident that draws attention is not part of the culture. It seems largely agreed upon that Spirit Bay was an important show that took a massive leap forward in Aboriginal representation in Western media, and as entertainment, well, this fat white American quite enjoyed the 7 episodes he was able to find. It's a gem of a show, but it was a step, not the finish line, and there is still work to be done, especially here in the United States. I mean, come on guys, we don't even have an equivalent of this, and this show is 36 years old. It's not entirely clear if Nickelodeon was actually considering picking up this show, but if they were, it would be going back to a model of Canadian family dramas set against the country's natural landscape. Between 1981 and 1983, Nickelodeon aired 2 of Spirit Bay's predecessors, Adventures in Rainbow Country and Matt and Jenny, both of which we'll actually be discussing next month. And maybe that's the reason they ultimately didn't pick it up. Spirit Bay represented a genre of television that Nickelodeon abandoned 5 years prior. Perhaps instead of looking back, they should be looking forward.
It's time now for Dynaman. 5 good-looking Japanese friends from all walks of life. Wushi, their leader, is Dyna Red. Juba, able to leap tall trees, is Dyna Black. Frankie, the human outboard motor, is Dyna Blue. Cowboy, the slow-thinking weapons expert, is Dyna Yellow. And their main squeeze slow gin is Dyna Pink.
With the sudden rise of cable television and home video in the late 70s and early 80s, Many people involved in the industry felt they weren't being paid properly, and in 1981, the Writers Guild of America held a 3-month strike. One result of the strike was halting the production of NBC's Saturday Night Live, and in an attempt to exploit the hole left in that time slot, USA Network released Night Flight, a 4-hour variety program that aired music videos, concert footage, celebrity interviews, short films, and feature films from around the globe, and a lot of oddball content. Basically, it was special delivery, only for the late-night 19-year-old stoner crowd. There's a lot more to it than that, but we'd be here all day if I got into Night Flight. One of the features created specifically for Night Flight was Dynaman, a comedy redubbing of the Super Sentai series Kagaku Sentai Dynaman. Super Sentai is a franchise based on teams of superheroes who wear color-coordinated outfits and use advanced weaponry, often involving the piloting of giant robots to fight monsters of various origin. Most Americans became familiar with Super Sentai when it was edited in with American footage to create the Power Rangers franchise, one of the biggest media juggernauts of the 1990s. But people are often surprised to discover that Power Rangers was not the first time Super Sentai aired on American television, with Dynaman beating it by at least 5 years. However, legacy does not equate to quality. Dynaman sucks. It doesn't actually change a lot in its reinvention of the original Japanese series. Names and a few character motivations are changed, but it's still mostly the same team superhero show beat by beat. The apparent comedy of Dynaman's 6 episodes just comes from pointing out how silly the original material is. And don't get me wrong, Super Sentai is super silly, but you're not clever in just pointing that out. You have to do something with it, riff on it or something. Most of the humor here comes from white people doing comically exaggerated Asian voices, which is, not good. I wouldn't be surprised if some people were tricked into thinking that this was a legit dub of the original series. In any case, someone must have determined that Dynaman might attract a young audience despite being created for people smoking weed at 11 p.m., and so it aired on special delivery in 1988. I don't know if all the episodes were shown. With only 6, that would have been pretty easy. Maybe someone behind the scenes thought about expanding the concept into a full series for kids, but ultimately it was decided to leave it at that. Kids don't want this Super Sentai stuff, it'll never catch on. You probably guessed why I've included Dynaman in all of this. In 2011, Nickelodeon became the official home of the Power Rangers franchise, and has continued the series to this day. Dynaman offers us a brief what might have been scenario, but ultimately, it shook out for the best. I called special delivery Nickelodeon's junk drawer, and I stand by that. But it would also be fair to call it Nickelodeon's spice rack, bringing in small bits and bobs to accentuate, cover up, and experiment with flavor. You can't make a meal out of spice alone, but it helps things from getting bland. Be you a children's film with cheap broadcast rights, a sports documentary to make your main sports show seem more legit, a rock concert to get attention of the teens, an aging after-school special to fill time, a test run of an interesting TV show, or some actual garbage, special delivery was the home for you.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, we take a look at one of Spirit Bay's early predecessors and discuss just how Canadian television related with native audiences. Today's shout out goes to all the dozen online newspaper archives out there. There's a lot of them, and people put in a lot of hard work going through these archives, finding TV listings and creating the list of special delivery episodes. To everyone who helped build the list, I salute you. This video is possible to my wonderful patrons on Patreon. Patreon is what keeps the lights on and gives me the time and resources to create these videos. If you'd like to see Knacks and other Pop Arena videos keep going into the future, perhaps consider signing up. Even $1 helps. So does liking, sharing, subscribing, hitting that bell icon, following me on Twitter. Those are the best ways to get my videos out into the public eye. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.